January 3, 1943. The sky over Saint-Nazaire burned with black smoke. Dozens of silver B-17 bombers cut through the cold air, engines shaking, oxygen masks frosting from every breath. In the tail of one of them, a bomber called Snap, Crackle, Pop, Sergeant Alan Eugene Magee adjusted the twin .50 caliber guns in his ball turret. The hum of the engines was steady. The world outside looked calm. Then the flak began. Black puffs erupted around the formation. Metal shards hissed through the air, bursts tearing through aluminum. Inside the intercom, someone shouted, "Right wing hit!" The bomber lurched violently. Magee's turret jammed. He pounded the controls, shouting for help, but the hydraulic line had been cut. Above him, he could hear the gunner screaming. The smell of burning fuel filled the cabin. He climbed out, crawling through smoke and twisted metal. Flames licked the ceiling. The plane shuddered again, hit squarely by another shell. The right wing broke away. The bomber rolled into a spiral. Magee was thrown against the wall, the oxygen mask ripped from his face. He felt the aircraft tearing itself apart, the sound like an endless scream of steel. Then there was silence and wind. He was no longer inside the plane. The fuselage had vanished. The world was nothing but sky and speed. Magee was falling through the frozen air at 22,000 feet, spinning helplessly. His parachute was gone, torn away. The air burned his lungs, his vision blurred. Below him, the French coast turned slowly, impossibly far away. He passed pieces of his own aircraft tumbling beside him. A wing, a gun mount, fragments of men he'd known minutes earlier. He thought, this is how it ends. But the end never came. He crashed through the glass roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station, smashing through beams and iron frames, shattering 100 windows before hitting the floor. Then, darkness. When he woke hours later, he was in a German infirmary, covered in bandages, his arm broken, ribs shattered, teeth gone. A doctor stared at him, shaking his head in disbelief. "It's not possible," the man whispered. "You fell from the sky." Alan Magee closed his eyes and murmured, "I guess I did." He had fallen 4 miles, lived through fire, steel, and gravity, and this was only the beginning. The newspapers called him the luckiest man alive. Radio announcers told his story with awe, how an airman fell 4 miles without a parachute and lived. To a world drowning in casualty lists, the word lucky sounded holy. People wanted to believe he was touched by something divine. Magee himself wasn't sure what to believe. When reporters later asked what saved him, he said softly, "Maybe God wanted me to see what comes next." But war had no gods, only odds. Luck, in the arithmetic of total war, was not protection. It was variance. The same dice that spared Magee's life had already killed tens of thousands of others. The illusion of miracle came from misunderstanding the scale. Every bomber crew joked about luck. They carried rabbit's feet, poker chips, bits of family photos in their jackets. Luck became a religion inside the cold bellies of B-17s. Men told themselves it was the reason they came back from a mission while another crew vanished over the channel. They needed the myth, because the truth, that survival was random, was unbearable. Alan Magee never thought of himself as lucky before that day. He had already survived 6 crashes, engine fires, and flak bursts. Each time, someone else died. Each time, he crawled out of twisted metal and went back to the sky. Reporters saw a man chosen by fortune. The men who flew beside him saw something else. A man who kept showing up inside the worst probabilities. The military called it morale. The statisticians called it noise. The difference between life and death in the air war could be measured in inches of steel or seconds of timing. Magee's luck wasn't magic. It was mathematics disguised as miracle. Yet the story of a man saved by chance spread faster than the war itself. It gave civilians something pure to hold on to in a world ruled by case. The legend became cleaner than the facts, but the facts mattered. Every flak burst followed a trajectory. Every survival followed a pattern. The closer you looked, the smaller luck became. Magee would spend the rest of his life watching people call him lucky. He never corrected them. He just smiled and said, "Maybe so." But deep down, he knew what the numbers meant, that luck wasn't a blessing. It was just a name people gave to the survivors of impossible math. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had become the deadliest campaign in American history. The U.S. 8th Air Force sent out hundreds of bombers every morning, and every evening counted who came back. Daylight precision bombing, the generals called it, but for the men inside those bombers, it felt like suicide in formation. Each mission began before dawn. Crews climbed into their B-17s, strapped on oxygen masks, and waited for the cold to crawl into their bones. They joked to hide the fear. Once the engine started, the jokes stopped. At 25,000 feet, it was 40 degrees below zero. The bombers flew in tight boxes, 30 planes at a time, each one depending on the others for defensive fire. The formations looked invincible from the ground, but from inside they were cages of noise and terror. Flak bursts blackened the sky. Every shell was timed to explode exactly where the bombers had to fly. Shrapnel tore through aluminum like paper. Crews watched other planes vanish in orange flashes, vaporized before they could even bail out. Each mission's survival rate hovered around 70%. The odds of finishing 25 missions, what the Air Force called a full tour, were 1 in 4. They called the planes flying fortresses, but the men inside called them flying coffins. The survival rate for bomber crews in 1943 was lower than for infantry at Stalingrad. No other branch of the U.S. military had such consistent losses. Magee's 303rd Bomb Group, based in Molesworth, England, was one of the hardest-hit units. Its men flew the same routes day after day. Bremen, Hamburg, Saint-Nazaire, Schweinfurt. German gunners knew every corridor. Luftwaffe fighters waited above the clouds. Once the bombers crossed the French coast, they were on their own. Fighter escorts couldn't reach that far until the P-51 arrived a year later. Every flight became a rolling experiment in probability. Engines failed from cold. Oxygen lines froze. Men lost fingers to frostbite before the first enemy appeared. Those who made it through were called lucky, not because they were brave, but because the math had spared them. Inside this world, Magee's record seemed supernatural. 7 times he flew on missions that should have killed him. 7 times he came home bruised but breathing. His crewmates half believed he carried a charm from another world. But the truth was simpler. In a system that consumed men by the thousands, someone had to land on the far edge of the curve. The war in the air was not a duel. It was an equation, a contest between production lines, probabilities, and human endurance. Magee's story would live because it broke that equation. He was the outlier that made statistics look human. In war, numbers don't lie. They only hurt. And in 1943, the math of survival for a bomber crew was merciless. Each B-17 mission over occupied Europe carried a 4% chance of death. It sounded small until you multiplied it. 25 missions were required to finish a tour. The cumulative odds of living through them all came to barely 1 in 3. For every 10 crews that left England, 7 would vanish before they ever reached home. The statistics were printed quietly, buried in reports stamped confidential. But the men in the barracks didn't need the paperwork. They could see the empty bunks after every sortie. When the 303rd Bomb Group went to briefing each morning, the men glanced at the maps on the wall, not to learn the target, but to calculate the distance between the base and the flak belts. They knew the arithmetic of death better than any mathematician. Alan Magee's record broke every probability curve. 7 separate times he was inside an aircraft that either crashed, burned, or exploded. 7 times he crawled or was dragged from the wreckage. A combat analyst later ran the numbers. The odds of surviving one catastrophic bomber incident were roughly 1 in 100,000. Multiply that by 7, and the probability of Magee living through them all was less than 1 in a billion. Statistically, he shouldn't have existed. Yet, he did. The human mind cannot process odds that small, so it replaces math with meaning. Newspapers called it divine protection. His fellow airmen called him a man God forgot to collect. Statisticians called it a sampling anomaly, a rare byproduct of enormous casualty pools. But behind the figures was a darker pattern. The air war consumed men faster than any other branch because it depended on industrial repetition. Every mission was the same procedure, repeated hundreds of times. Every procedure carried identical risk. That consistency made the losses feel random, when in truth, they followed a brutal logic. Magee wasn't safe because he was lucky. He was merely the survivor that probability requires to make chaos appear fair. In every system of destruction, one man has to live long enough to prove the pattern. The math stripped away romance. It revealed that survival was not courage rewarded, but variance sustained. Magee's life became the proof that even in total war, someone always lands on the right side of the curve, until the day they don't. He wasn't blessed. He was counted. The target that morning was the submarine yards of Saint-Nazaire. Flak City, the crews called it. The Luftwaffe defended it with everything they had. The 303rd Bomb Group knew the route by heart. Cross the French coast at 20,000 feet, descend to bombing altitude, hold formation, and pray. Alan Magee climbed into his usual spot, the ball turret beneath the fuselage of the B-17 snap. Crackle. Pop. He checked his twin Brownings, oxygen line, and intercom cord. His fingers were numb before takeoff. At 10:30 a.m., the bombers crossed the coastline. Black puffs bloomed around them, flak shells bursting at preset heights. Each explosion was a guess by German gunners, and every guess seemed right. The formation jolted as the air filled with metal. Magee rotated his turret, searching for fighters. He saw them almost immediately. Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs diving from the sun, spitting cannon fire. The first rounds ripped through the left wing. The next burst hit the fuselage, killing the radio operator instantly. Magee's turret shuddered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across his goggles. He shouted, "I'm hit! Turret's jammed!" But the intercom was dead. Smoke poured through the fuselage. The pilot tried to keep the bomber in formation, but the right engine was gone. Fire raced along the wing. Inside, men fought to reach the hatch. Magee clawed his way up from the turret, coughing in the thick smoke. Another burst hit, and the entire aircraft lurched violently. The right wing folded back. For an instant, Magee saw daylight through the side of the plane. Then nothing. He was outside, tumbling through air. He couldn't breathe. The wind tore at his uniform, his eyes, his skin. His parachute was gone, ripped away when the fuselage broke. He fell faster, the roar of the air swallowing every thought. The world below was a blur of clouds and coastline. He tried to scream, but there was no sound. He passed burning fragments of his own aircraft, pieces of metal spinning beside him like dying stars. For a moment, he thought he saw one of his crewmates falling too, motionless. The sky was full of falling things. At 20,000 feet, he began to lose consciousness. At 10,000, the air thickened and his eyes opened again. The ground was rushing up, a gray city framed by rivers and smoke. Then he hit the roof of the Saint-Nazaire train station. The glass exploded beneath him. Steel beams tore open like paper. Each impact slowed his speed by a fraction. He crashed through 2 floors before coming to rest on the concrete below, broken and bleeding, but alive. German soldiers found him minutes later, barely breathing. Doctors counted 28 fractures, severe internal injuries, and torn tendons. Yet no organ was destroyed. The curved roof had absorbed the worst of the impact. The same glass that should have killed him had saved him. When Magee woke, he was lying in a military infirmary. A German officer leaned over and said in disbelief, "You are a very lucky man." Magee managed a faint smile. "No," he whispered, "just not finished yet." The doctors in Saint-Nazaire tried to explain it, but the numbers didn't make sense. No parachute, a fall from 22,000 feet, 28 broken bones, and he was still breathing. Reporters called it divine. Physicists later called it improbable, but not impossible. The truth lay somewhere between gravity and geometry. Terminal velocity for a human body in free fall is about 120 miles per hour. Impact at that speed usually means disintegration. But Magee's descent had been chaotic, his body spinning, limbs flailing, air resistance increasing. The atmosphere itself had conspired to slow him. The thin winter air, the shredded fabric of his uniform, even the drag of his boots, all combined to alter the math by degrees that mattered. Then came the roof. The train station's vaulted design curved like a shallow bowl. When Magee struck the glass, it shattered outward, absorbing part of the energy. Each layer he passed through, iron beams, glass panes, timber rafters, bled speed from his body. By the time he hit the stone floor, the force had dropped below fatal threshold. He hadn't cheated physics. He had fallen through a chain of coincidences that behaved like mercy. Doctors studying the case later compared it to other rare survivals. The British gunner Nicholas Alcamaide, who fell 18,000 feet into pine trees and snow, the Yugoslav stewardess Vesna Vulovic, who survived a jet explosion and a 30,000-foot fall decades later. Each story defied probability, yet each obeyed the same hidden variables: angle, structure, air drag, chance alignment. Magee's miracle was simply a perfect storm of imperfections. Every factor that should have killed him was slightly off target, every death equation missed by inches. When he awoke in the German infirmary, his first thought was not about luck, but about his crew. None of them had survived. He was the statistical remainder, the single success among 8 failures, the inevitable survivor every dataset demands. The physics were impersonal. The human meaning was not. War had turned survival into a lottery written by math and machinery. Magee had won a draw that no one should ever have entered. And in that strange victory lay the cruel symmetry of modern war, where even life itself became a statistical accident. Before Saint-Nazaire, Alan Magee had already lived through 6 rehearsals for death. Each one left him more familiar with the impossible, more comfortable inside the odds that devoured everyone else. The first came in training over New Mexico. His B-17 lost an engine during a low-altitude drill and clipped a ridge. The landing gear collapsed, the fuselage slid across the desert, and the plane burst into flames. Magee crawled out through a hole in the wing, coughing, his uniform smoking. 2 men died inside. He walked away with burns on his hands. The accident board called it pilot error. He called it beginner's math. The second was a mid-air collision over England. 2 fortresses in his formation collided in cloud cover. One sheared the tail off the other. Magee's plane went into a spin. The crew bailed out into freezing rain. He landed in a field of mud, bruised but alive. They found the other plane in fragments 6 miles away. The third came on a raid to Bremen. Flak exploded beneath the fuselage, punching a hole the size of a door beside Magee's gun position. The shockwave tore his headset away and filled the compartment with smoke. The gunner next to him was shredded instantly. Magee's seatbelt snapped. He blacked out and woke up with the aircraft still flying. Blood on his face, nothing else. The fourth was a fuel tank fire on takeoff. The bomber caught flame, skidded down the runway, and detonated. He'd been left off the manifest at the last minute because of a mechanical issue with his gun mount. When the replacement crew died, Magee realized how thin the boundary was between presence and absence. The fifth was a high-altitude mission over the Ruhr. Oxygen froze in the supply lines. Magee and the tail gunner passed out. The pilot dove the aircraft to 10,000 feet, saving them both. He woke vomiting blood, his lungs half frozen. The sixth was a ditching in the English Channel. Engine trouble forced the crew to abandon their plane. They inflated rafts in icy waves and waited 12 hours before a rescue launch spotted them. 3 died of exposure. Magee survived with frostbite and a calmness that disturbed even him. Each episode stacked atop the next, forming a column of near misses too tall to comprehend. Men joked that he was indestructible. He didn't laugh. He understood what the jokes were hiding, that each survival increased the pressure of inevitability. Probability has no memory, but humans do. He could feel it building, the silent math waiting to collect its debt. When Saint-Nazaire came, it felt almost expected. The world around him had narrowed to 2 options: live again or not. And when he woke under the white ceiling of a German hospital, he realized that surviving wasn't victory. It was proof that the equation still had room for one more impossible answer. The men who captured Alan Magee could not believe he was alive. They carried him through the rubble of the Saint-Nazaire station on a stretcher made from doors, whispering as they went. At the local infirmary, German doctors worked in silence, cleaning glass from his wounds. His right arm was broken in 2 places, ribs crushed, teeth shattered, eyelids torn. Yet when they touched his wrist, the pulse was steady. One doctor muttered, "Der Mann ist nicht zu töten." The man cannot be killed. When he woke fully, Magee learned he was now a prisoner of war. He would be sent to Stalag Luft 17B in Austria, a camp already filled with thousands of downed airmen. The journey took weeks. He traveled by train, bandaged and dazed, through bombed-out cities whose ruins mirrored his own. At Stalag Luft 17B, winter swallowed everything. Barracks built for 200 men held 500. Food came in watery soups, sometimes a slice of bread the color of dust. Guards shouted orders in a language he barely understood. Outside, frost hung like smoke on the wire. Magee could barely walk at first. His arm healed crooked, his lungs ached every time he breathed. Yet he worked, hauling wood, fixing roofs, helping other prisoners who had no strength left. He became the quiet man who never complained. When new captives arrived and asked about his scars, someone else would tell the story. "That's the guy who fell 4 miles and lived." The legend followed him through every block. Some called him cursed, others blessed. He said nothing. Inside, he carried the faces of the men who hadn't made it. Each night, he dreamed of falling again, waking just before he hit the ground. In 1945, the guards vanished. The camp gates were left open as the Germans fled the advancing Allies. Magee, weighing barely 100 pounds, limped toward freedom with the others. American troops found them on the road, ragged and hollow-eyed. When he returned home months later, newspapers called him the lucky airman. They showed photographs of him smiling, the scars hidden beneath his uniform. He thanked the doctors, the rescuers, the faith that had carried him through. But when the reporters left, he told a friend quietly, it wasn't luck. It was just life refusing to quit. For years afterward, he couldn't stand fireworks or loud engines. He worked in aviation anyway, repairing planes instead of flying them. He married, raised children, and never once called himself a hero. In interviews, when asked what he learned from the war, he would pause and say, "That life doesn't ask permission to keep going. It just does." The man who fell from the sky had found his gravity again. Quiet, steady, unremarkable, alive. Alan Magee's name lived on because people needed him to mean something. The newspapers called him the miracle airman, the symbol of divine favor in a war ruled by machines. But the truth was colder, and in its way, more beautiful. Magee's story wasn't about luck, it was about the scale of chance inside human conflict. How, among millions of losses, one improbable survival becomes proof that randomness still allows hope. He didn't survive because fate protected him. He survived because the math demanded at least one man to make it through every 1,000 who didn't. He became the visible exception that made the slaughter bearable. That's what luck really was, statistics written in blood, given a human face so the rest of us could sleep at night. For Magee, that knowledge cut deep. He never called himself special. When asked how it felt to beat death 7 times, he said, "I didn't beat anything. I just wasn't finished." To him, luck was noise in a system too large to understand. War turned luck into language because words like probability and attrition could not comfort the living. But for the men who fought, the difference was survival measured in seconds, inches, and heartbeats. Magee had stood inside that space longer than most. He was proof not that miracles existed, but that even in the most predictable machinery of destruction, variance still had a heartbeat. He lived to 84. Long after the war ended, he visited Saint-Nazaire, standing beneath the restored glass roof of the station he had once fallen through. Locals recognized him, asked for stories. He looked up at the sunlight on the steel beams and said only, "It was a long way down." In that understatement lay the truth of his legend. There was no magic, no miracle, only a man who fell through the arithmetic of death and landed, somehow, on the side that lived. In a world that measures everything, his story reminds us that survival still defies explanation, even when it obeys every law. Alan Magee's story ended quietly. No parades, no speeches, just time and gravity doing what they always do. He grew old, his scars fading to pale lines, his memories softening into silence. When people asked if he believed in luck, he would shrug. "I believe in math," he said, "and in stubbornness." He died in 2003 at 84 years old, peacefully, on his own terms. The man who fell 4 miles and lived longer than most of his generation had finally landed for good. But the idea of him stayed, because in every war there's always one who shouldn't have survived, the one that makes the rest of it make sense. Magee's fall was not a miracle. It was a mirror, reflecting how fragile human life can be.